Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Tenae Stewart is a practicing cottage witch, a certified astrologer, a coach, and a published author. She is on a mission to embody simplicity in magic, astrology, and self-care. Her work empowers modern witches to nourish their minds, bodies, and intuition so they can be their most magical selves all day, every day. Tenae Stewart, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so exciting to have you on. We were just chatting a little bit before, and we're actually in the same time zone, so it's like morning for both of us.
Yes, I know. It's so rare.
It is a rare thing. So our first question for all the guests on the show is why write in this age of TikTok and social media and podcasts? Why write books?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's always an inherent magic in something printed. And I don't have anything against, I read ebooks all the time, right? Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with reading something digital, or reading a blog or reading an article, right? Like there's so much wisdom there, but I think there is a lot of inherent magic in something printed, something you can actually hold in your hands. And, I think every writer has the experience of every new book that you write, getting that first box of books or that first proof copy, and holding it in your hands for the first time is really magical and just never gets old. So I think that there's something really valuable and unique about something printed. And, then there's such an ecosystem around that too, local bookstores that have their own magic in so many ways. And connect their communities. There's such a community element. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I think that that experience of that first box of books, I think that's just a universal, wow, for writers. It's like you've imagined
Absolutely.
This thing, and there it is in the flesh or in the carbon tree parts or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you blogged for a long time and you've written for magazines and things like that. So what was the move from that to publishing?
Yeah. So I have kind of a little bit of a weird, unusual story. So I was a blogger for a long time. I had a blog many, many years ago called The Witch of Howling Creek. I had a few, I think, interim blogs in the meantime on other not necessarily witchy topics. And then I started what became my business, started as a blog, The Witch of Loop and Hollow. I started in spring 2016. And it was initially really just supposed to be really a personal blog. I don't think I even really had any plans for a lot of social media and things like that. It was just a way to kind of hold myself accountable in my practice and document a lot of things I was going through at the time. And so I blogged kind of on and off for about 6 to 8 months before I realized that this was something that could be so much bigger than just a personal blog, and that I wanted it to be more than that. And so I started, selling some small readings and things like that. And then I created a course. I created a few small courses in the meantime. And eventually I created a group program that was all about creating daily rituals, morning and evening rituals, things like that. And it was really all about kind of the intersection of magic and self-care. And so I started making a lot of, writing blog posts and making a lot of YouTube videos and things like that on those topics, kind of magical self-care. And that was in late 2018, early 2019. And in, I think it was April of 2019, I had a publishing company reach out to me totally out of the blue, unsolicited, and they wanted to publish a book on witchcraft and self-care. That was kind of all they knew. They just knew this was a market they wanted to tap into, and they wanted to find someone to write a really amazing book on that topic. And so they had come across my blogs and videos and thought that, I had a good voice. They liked my audience. And would I be interested in writing a book? Which was a very wild email to get. And I, of course, initially I didn't even think it was real, that I looked into it. Oh, this is a real person. This is a real company. And so I started talking with them, and that's my publishing company that I still work with, Skyhorse Publishing, and they've been wonderful. They don't publish a lot of books in the spiritual and witchy space. I'm one of just a few authors that they have in this genre. But they're so supportive and so open to, what I want to write about, what I want to share, what's important to me to include or not include. So yeah, it went from, blogger to author, but it was kind of a funny transition.
Yeah. So what was the first book?
My first book was The Modern Witch's Guide to Magical Self-Care, which is really the first half of the book is almost kind of instructional in a lot of ways of like, what is a ritual? How can you create rituals that you can be consistent with, that work for you, that align with your astrological chart? And then the second half of the book is all suggested rituals in kind of different categories, like connecting with nature, working with your intuition, things like that.
And then the new book is The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic.
Yes.
Right. It's like long titles. I'm always afraid I'm going to scramble words. But it kind of has a similar layout a little bit, because the beginning is kind of a little bit more instructional. And
it does, yeah. And it was obviously somewhat intentional. Like they're kind of companion books, but they're very different in a lot of ways too. The new book, the first half is instructional in the sense of helping people understand what are the moon phases, what are the seasons, what does astrology have to do with either, how are those cycles all kind of connected. And then the second half is all recipes, which was definitely like really fun, but kind of an edge for me. I'd published, recipes on my blog, but that was about it. So to come up with, 60 plus brand new recipes was definitely a challenge and different than coming up with a bunch of different rituals, but it was really, really fun to write both of them. And I actually think that the second one in many ways I feel came easier because talking about that intersection of these different cycles of the sun and the seasons, the moon and the planets, is something I can talk about like all day, every day. So it was a very easy book in that sense to write. But, it's never really easy.
No, and I do think, there is this idea that once you have written a book, the next one is easier. And I think in some ways it can be if your mindset is, well, I've done this at least once. But it's also a brand new thing. Like it can also be just as difficult as the first one.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely think that there's something to be said for, I've worked through this challenge before and I can do it again, and it can, come more easily the second time or the third time. But it's also you're either writing on a completely new topic or, a different topic, which was kind of the case with this one. Or maybe you're going deeper with something you've already written about, and maybe you already wrote 50,000 words on working with the moon, and now you're going to write another 50,000 words about that, and that can feel like, oh my gosh, do I really have that much to say about this topic? So I'm a big like outliner, not really, really in depth, but I like to know like what chapter am I working on? What is it about? What are kind of my key points that I want to make sure I get to? And then, writing in chunks, because if I try to sit down and write, okay, I'm going to write this whole chapter from start to finish, I just completely lose the thread. So I kind of write in chunks, I write a couple pages at a time.
So what does research for these kind of books look like for you?
So a lot of it is very personal. I definitely bring a lot of my own experience and stories and rituals that I've done or recipes I like to make into both of these books and, maybe future books. But I think a lot of it is not necessarily research for any individual book that I've been working on, but more like the culmination of a lot of research and work that I've done over the years. So like I have my astrology certification. That was, a few years of working towards that, which definitely informed both books, but especially the second one, which is really heavily astrology based. So there's definitely an element of research, especially around, working with certain plants or certain crystals. And, I definitely spent, when writing the second book, a lot of time sitting on our couch, just sort of like all of my herbal books piled around me, checking, okay, what does this one work for? Okay, how do these work together? Testing teas, things like that. But yeah, a lot of it is more like the culmination of research and reading and work for myself and with my clients, over many years.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, one of the things I like about the recipes in the book that you say is that, if you don't have this thing or you don't like this thing or you're allergic to it, just leave it out. Like, it's not, here are some ideas for some substitutions. I have written a cookbook and I taught culinary school for a long time. And, I always tell people it's a map, not a, it'll get you where you need to go, but you can make detours. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like I say in the book, like that's something that I run into a lot is I'm allergic to chamomile. And it's a very common ingredient that's in a lot of recipes, in a lot of spell work, as an essential oil, as an herb, as a dried flower, like you find it everywhere. So I'm constantly leaving it out or substituting it with something. So I have so much empathy for that, having dealt with it myself very often. And having a few other obscure and random allergies as well, And I think that's something that we can really put a lot of pressure on ourselves about, is like, oh, this spell or this recipe has to be exactly right. It has to be exactly how it was in the book, or I have to follow these steps exactly to the letter, or it's, it's not going to work, or it's not going to be right, or I didn't do it right. And like none of that is true. Like we have to, both be able to make things our own and follow our intuition on what ingredients to include in a spell or in a recipe or in any other circumstance in our practice. And also to have the practical boundary as well of like, I don't like this thing. I don't have to use it, or I'm allergic to this thing. I can't use it,
Or I just hate the way it smells, like vervain, just like, I think I can't stand the way it smells.
Yeah. And, I think that's so common that, people feel like if it's going to be like an herbal tea, it often tastes bad, or, an essential oil blend that has a magical purpose might smell bad. Like it doesn't have to. If you don't like it, replace it or leave it out.
Yeah. And I always think too, I think there's this idea that your witchcraft, like you said, has to be precise all the time. And I just can't believe that, like, cunning folk and grannies who are trying to make stuff work. They just made do. Like, they just made do. That's how it works.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when you get a chance to write in your chunks, so what do you have rituals around that? Or like, what is like Tenae's perfect writing day?
Yeah. Honestly, I like to write a lot at like a coffee shop. I just find it's funny because I have an office space that I work at, and I write a lot for my regular work, even when I'm not working on a book. But I just, for some reason, cannot sit at my computer and write a chapter. Like I just can't. I will just like do anything else to distract myself, Oh, I need to get up and get some water. Oh, I need to check my phone, So I like to go to the coffee shop and just like put headphones in, listen to instrumental music, drink some tea, like that works really well for me. And I can usually write like a good hour or two like that sitting at the coffee shop. So that's kind of like, I wrote a lot of the second book that way. Or just kind of sitting on the couch with my laptop. Same thing. Usually I listen to music, try to like put my phone on the other side of the room, but it doesn't always happen that way. And then, yeah, like I said, especially with the second book, the first book, there wasn't really a lot of outside research because so much of it was just my experience. But the second book, because it was so herbal based, I wanted it to have not so many different plants and, tons of recipes. Only a plant was only in one recipe in the book. I didn't want that because I wanted it to be more accessible, that, if you buy, 5, 10, 15 different things, you're going to be able to make most of the recipes in the book. Right. But I also didn't want it to be boring. I didn't want to, be too repetitive. So there was a real balance there of, kind of flipping through all of my herbal books, like, okay, which plants are going to work well for these different couple of purposes that I might be able to reuse in different recipes and things like that. So when I was really deep in that, obviously didn't want to bring the stacks of books to the coffee shop. So then I would really sit on my couch with my laptop, books all over the coffee table, kind of it that way.
Yeah, I am. Before the pandemic, was a coffee shop writer. Like, that was hardcore because I write fiction. So it's like, sometimes you hit a vein and you just go for hours, and sometimes it's like pulling teeth and you get 3 sentences out in a day. And so writing at the coffee shop was always my way to distract myself from the things that would distract me at home. Like, I could go do laundry. Like you said, I could check my phone. I could find ways to procrastinate writing. And since the pandemic, it's kind of swapped. Like, I've gotten better at writing at my desk because it was really the only option. And sometimes I will do work. Like, I have, contract that I get paid for. I'll go do that somewhere else. And then now my desk is for writing. But
sure,
it's a weird transition because of the pandemic. But I do miss those coffee shop writing days.
Yeah, so my first book, I turned in the manuscript in January of 2020. So I finished it like right before everything started. And then the second book, I wrote much more quickly than I wrote the first book. I wrote it in I think it was about 3 months, really, maybe 4. And it was last summer, basically. And most of California was open at the time. And so I was able to go to the coffee shop. We were definitely still masking. But I was so grateful to be able to get out of the house to write, because at the time I did not have an office space yet. I was still working at home. So I had my office in my house, but it was exponentially more distracting because it was like both my workspace and my house space, and it was in the bedroom. So it was just like, it was really hard to write at home. So I was so grateful that last summer I was able to write at the coffee shop. I don't know. It might have taken me a lot longer. I might not have made that deadline if I'd had to write it all on the couch.
I think that's an important thing for a lot of writers, is that space. I mean, not to, step on Virginia Woolf's toes or anything, but you just need a space that you can do that in. And like you said, like, we live in an apartment. We specifically, even though we were moving to California, we're like, we have to get 2 bedrooms because we have to have an office. Like, even though it's just my husband and I, it was like, we have to have an office. Like, it just has to be separate from the rest of the house. And we're in a position where we could do that. And I realized that as a privileged position. And I feel for people who have to have those spaces in their bedroom or at the dining table, that it's never really yours. It's hard to make that work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it was very difficult. And, because so there was a period of, I don't know, probably a year almost, where my boyfriend and I both had our offices in our bedroom. And it is a pretty large room. So it wasn't, we each had kind of our dedicated spaces. But, if you both needed to be working, it was so hard. It was so hard, especially for writing. And yeah, I had always worked kind of a little bit here and there in the coffee shop. But I think it was really writing that new book where I was like, I have to go somewhere else because I just cannot think straight. I can't focus. But even at the coffee shop, I do still always have to listen to music. And that's always been something, even when I was in like high school, college, when I would write papers, I have to put headphones on and listen to instrumental music. If there's words, it's not going to work. If it's, just through my phone speaker, it's not good enough. Like, it has to be like, that's, I think, probably the most important ritual of writing for me is, and, I do it even when I'm writing just, for my website or regular writing, not book writing, is I just need that like quiet music, not total silence, just the right amount of just the right amount of
what kind of music do you like to listen to?
I mostly listen to either like instrumental jazz or like instrumental Celtic music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm always fascinated about what writers choose to listen to, and people who have listened from the beginning will know that this has come up a lot. That the first series I wrote, I listened to punk music with lyrics. Although granted, punk music, you can't always understand what they're saying. And I've talked to a couple writers who like listen to heavy metal when they write. And I think it's just so interesting to me that some folks have this like, oh, it can be anything. It doesn't matter. It just needs to be music. And then I have a friend who I interviewed for the show early on, and she listens to like Turkish rock music in Turkish. She said it can't be in English. It can have words, but it can't be in English.
That's fair. That I might maybe like,
yeah,
because I definitely think on my like Celtic Pandora station occasionally something comes up and like can't really understand what they're saying, so it's okay.
Yeah, but it does kind of set a tone, and I do think there's something about headphones, about that cocooning, especially in a public space. I always like to listen to whatever the coffee shop is playing and listen to people talk, but I think that's a fiction, because I'm writing fiction, I'm like absorbing, like watching characters like form kind of thing. So I think it's a little different probably, but.
Totally. Well, and I don't know, I think there is almost like a background noise piece to it where, I won't usually turn, unless, someone's having like a really loud conversation or something, like I won't usually turn my headphones up so loud that I can't still kind of hear the ambient noise too. So I think that's like the perfect combination, right? It's like the coffee shop sounds, my music, and then I can get in the zone for at least, 30, 40 minutes.
Yeah, I tried some of those YouTube coffee shop ambient stations to try and get like kind of the vibe of it, but there's never people talking. It's just like the sound of like dishes clinking and some light jazz and the door opening and closing with bells on it or something, but there's never people chit-chattering. And that's always there's something about that particular kind of white noise that I really like and need. So
there is. Well, and I think it goes back to that kind of like community piece of when you write a book, like I feel like a book even more than something you write online, even though this applies to things online. But when you write a book, like it's not just for you, right? Like it's going to go out in the world and people are going to read it and they're going to have different opinions and different ideas about it. And like there is this community element. And I don't know, I think maybe there's a little piece of magic there of like when you write in a public space like that, I think it does kind of bring some of that community magic into what you're writing, even if it's not directly influencing what you're writing. I think there's some magic there.
Yeah, I think so too. And, just, like you said, absorbing that community piece. So with your writing, like now that you've published 2 books and you've said, future books could be in the offing, like what are your goals as a writer? Like, are you writing full time? What do you kind of see as the next step in your writing?
Yeah. So I don't really consider myself a full-time writer, although writing is such an important part of the other work that I do. More than anything, my full-time work is as more of a teacher and a coach. I have like seasonal subscriptions and things like that. I do astrology readings. And writing is a really important piece of all of those, but they're all different. My astrology readings are written. Which is unusual. Most people do them as like a video call or a recorded video or something like that. But I found that I liked being able to refer back to something written when I got a reading myself. I found I wouldn't go back to the video, And so I started doing these written readings, and so my readings are a couple thousand words. I write a few of those every month. And that's a very particular type of writing because it's very intuitive. Like it is this kind of, I think to an extent, like all writing is channeled in a way. But the readings, I find it more than any other thing that I do where, even especially if someone has a similar placement as someone that I've done a chart reading for recently, it might come through in a totally different way. So there's that type of writing that I do every month. And then I write, I actually take like a week or 2 every year to write all of my membership content for the year ahead. So I take a little writing retreat and write as much of it as I can in a big lump bulk, which is almost like writing a book in and of itself. But those are really fun. I put out a recipe every month. And so it's a lot of similar types of things as especially the second book. And so I have these kind of like chunks of writing that I do throughout the month or throughout the year for the various work that I do. And then books kind of just fit in there. What when I'm talking with my publisher about, okay, let's do this project, let's do that project. It's just sort of like, okay, all this other writing still has to keep happening. So the book needs to slot in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But yes, I think ultimately, I think the practical application of what I do is I'm a writer. I write for every piece of my work, really. But I think it manifests in a few different ways. I don't know. Does that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. And I think that that's true for a lot of folks who, even if you're writing creatively, odds are you're writing for something else, to either to pay the rent or, whatever, something else is going on too. But so I guess with the kind of writing that you do, because you are writing like as a coach, as an astrologer, and your books, like, how does writing impact your personal practice? I mean, do you pick up things from your writing that changes how you practice, or does that deepen any aspect of your practice?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that there's a flow between kind of like my professional work and my personal practice, just naturally, since they are so connected. But I think that I definitely have, in writing my books, I think I've been able to refine my own ideas about what I teach, but also what I believe for myself. It's funny because even when I look at blogs that I wrote years ago, right? Like so many years ago, I'm really writing about the same things. It's just much less refined, It's the same topics. It's the same things that have always been important to me. It's just that I didn't have as much of a clear opinion and a clear belief about them, And so I think that writing both books has really helped me kind of solidify a lot of what I believe in my own life and practice and spirituality. And then also be able to teach that in a clearer way as well, in a more impactful way. So I definitely think there is this, like, they feed each other in a lot of ways. And then in my practice, I don't necessarily do a lot of writing like outside of work. Or outside of a workspace. But journaling is definitely a really important part of my practice, which I feel is so completely different to me than, sitting down and writing a book or writing a reading or any other type of writing that I might do. And for one thing, it tends to be much more brief. Like, I'm not a prolific journaler. I know there's people who they'll fill like 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 pages every morning. And I'm like, no, I feel like a page. Like that's all you're going to get out of me in the morning, But it is like, words definitely are an important part of my practice in that way. I do some gratitude journaling. I journal on the cards that I pull. I do a lot of reflection, like, okay, 6 months ago when, like, okay, it's the full moon in Pisces, 6 months ago when the new moon was in Pisces, what was going on, and journaling about that. Like, so it feels like they're so completely separate, but ultimately, like, it's still words, it's still writing,
Yeah. So do you find that being, because so many people I've talked to on the show, they're writers for the most part and published writers. So if they are practicing witchcraft or pagan or magic or, whatever terminology they use, they are kind of by default public witches to some extent. Do you find that is a difficult space to be in sometimes? Or how does that impact like your day to day to be kind of a publicly practicing witch, I guess?
Yeah. Well, so it's really interesting because it was really the first book coming out that kind of forced me to accept that role and be really open about my practice. I had been very private, didn't really share it with anyone up until about 2017 is when I first really started to be more public about it. First intentionally with some people, and then kind of got outed in some other more public spaces that I wasn't really planning on, but ultimately was a good thing, So 2017 was kind of the first year that I started to accept that, but I still hadn't really told. There was a lot of people in my life I really hadn't told about my practice or beliefs. And then I was approached to write this book, and I did contemplate at the time, so I'd had a blog for a couple of years already at that point. And at the time I was using my real name, but I was using my initials in most spaces. And I had like kind of started to use my name, but I didn't really want to be searchable at the time. I just didn't it wasn't even really for any particular reason. I just wasn't ready, you know? And then when the book was coming out, I kind of like, well, okay, am I going to use a pseudonym? Is it going to be me? Am I going to use my initials? And I ultimately, I don't even know really what the driving factor was that made me decide to just use my real name. But I think it just felt right. It felt like it was time for that. And so then it was like, okay, well, my name is going to be on shelves, like, and I have a pretty recognizable name for that matter. So I guess I better tell people. And so I started, you know, telling more of my family and being more public, putting it on my, you know, Facebook page, things like that. And I don't know that I was shocked, but I was a little surprised by how little response I got, how little pushback I got. You know, got some good questions, some interesting questions and conversations. But even from the sections of my community and my family, friends, and things that I expected to get a lot of flack from, I really didn't. And I don't know if that, I honestly feel like that was more of an energetic boundary for me, that I was finally ready to tell people, and I was not open to their opinions about it, you know?
Yeah.
Like, which I think if I had been more open earlier, maybe I wouldn't have been able to hold that boundary so well. And maybe I would have had a different experience. But yeah, now I'm very public. It's everywhere. And you know, it's on the door of my office and things like that. And occasionally, yeah, you know, you get someone who is kind of questioning or confused or, you know, doesn't really understand. But I'm sure this has a lot to do with where I live. Is I live in a very accepting state and a very accepting town. So I don't get a lot of trouble about it. But yeah, it is. I think the edge that I've come up to the most recently was just this summer. You know, I obviously wasn't able to do any book signing events or anything for my first book because it came out height of the pandemic. And then even my second book came out in the spring of this year, like kind of right before things started to open back up in California. And so I really wasn't able to do any like official book launch events. And so just this summer, I've been doing some, you know, book signings and workshops and attending some markets. And the signings and the workshops are one thing, right? People are coming to see me. The markets are a little different. Like some of them have been very witchy, and some of them have been much more mainstream. And that one has been a little scary for me because you don't know when someone walks into the booth what they're going to say, what their thoughts are going to be. Right. But even with that, the vast majority of people, you know, if they're not there for it, they walk by and they don't come in. And I've also been amazed by the number of people who do come into my booth in those mainstream spaces and are like, oh my God, I didn't know there were other people like me here. I didn't know there was a community here. So that has been really, really phenomenal to just sort of, I don't know, be a representation for people in that way too.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, yeah, coming from somewhere that I was kind of out just because of the nature of the books I write. And I just had kind of made a decision, like I wasn't going to broadcast it, but I wasn't going to deny it either. I was like quietly stepping out of the broom closet, I guess. And here, like, you know, A, I don't really see that many people. And B, like nobody seems to care. It's just not really, it's not an issue. And, you know, online, you know, that is what it is. You just kind of take what you get. So. And yeah, I haven't really had any problems online either. And I think you are right that there is this like energetic boundary you kind of set around yourself and you're like, this is who I am. So
yeah, no, I definitely feel like I have received much less slack and issues over the years than a lot of people I know who are also public witches. And I think that is really energetic in a lot of ways. Probably the one that got under my skin the most over the years was when the first book came out. I was able to, even though we weren't able to do any in-person events, of course, I was able to get some local press. So there was an article about me in the book in a couple of local papers, one very mainstream paper. And And of course, I made the mistake of reading the comments on the online version of that article, which were all trash and nonsense. And that was one of the only instances, since I have been really public, of feeling like I was in front of the wrong people. I was in front of people who didn't understand and didn't have any desire to understand. But yeah, for the most part, even in other kind of mainstream spaces, I don't know. I think it is, especially in California, becoming so much more mainstream to have an alternative spirituality. Even the word witch or magic, certainly astrology, is becoming more and more accepted and more something that people are seeking out.
Mm-hmm. So you just mentioned kind of being in front of the wrong people. So who do you kind of see as your audience, and what do you hope they take away from your work?
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, I speak to people who already identify as witches or think they might identify that way, who are at least open to that idea, which I was really glad, actually, that, because, my publisher chooses my titles. I don't choose my titles. I have a lot of say and a lot of control over the content, and even over the book covers, but not really over the titles. And I was actually really glad that they opted to put, modern witch right in the title. Because I think it sets people up to really understand what is inside. And that, I think it has kind of that like good repelling effect of someone who isn't open to that, isn't even going to pick it up. So I mostly do speak to people who that word is already something that they're claiming or getting ready to claim. But with that said, my gosh, sorry, there's like a spider web right above my desk that I just saw when I looked up. Totally lost my train of thought there.
No, it's like a very witchy thing. Like, oh, and by the way, I have spiders right here.
Oh my gosh. Okay, what was I saying? I was saying, speaking of people who identify as witches.
Oh yeah, you got it.
But mostly people who, are really coming to it as a spiritual practice, as a self-care practice, right? They're wanting this sort of like physical, spiritual, emotional support. And so really all of my work, even though I have different tools, different modalities, different practices, everything comes down to, nurturing and nourishing ourselves. On all of these different levels. It's very much about mental health. It's about physical health. It's about intuitive and spiritual connection. And so, I mostly speak to people who have that already identification with witchcraft, but not necessarily everyone who does. It's more kind of those who are seeking it out as a spiritual practice, as a personal practice, as a way to feel connected in their daily lives. So those have kind of become my big themes, my big words, is like magic in your daily life. Feeling connected all the time, being consistent. Consistency has become a really big theme in a lot of what I do. And it's funny because actually writing, it was consistency was something I had always spoken to in a way. But writing the second book really helped me refine that and discover that was like such a big theme for me and such a big theme for my people. And now it's so fascinating. When people join my seasonal program, they fill out a little welcome form so I can get to know them. And like 9 times out of 10, people there's a little section where they can fill in, what are you struggling with? Or what do you feel challenged by in your practice? And that 90% of people say, I'm struggling to be consistent. And has been really interesting since writing the second book, how much that has become this kind of like core theme that I get to help people with, because it is something that both comes naturally to me and that I've learned, how to allow an evolution, that consistency doesn't mean what we think it means. And, working with the seasons and the moon teaches us that it doesn't mean the same thing all the time, right? So yeah, I think I got a little off track, but
no, it makes sense. And I think it touches on something I've talked to with other writers about, this idea that, writers write every day. Well, not all writers write every day, and not all magical practitioners and witches practice magic every day. I mean, sometimes you may live your life in ways that feed that, but you're not like sitting down and spellcasting every day. Like that's not necessarily how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely, working with these cycles, right, of the seasons and the moon and astrology has always been there. Like that's always been the foundation of my practice 10 plus years ago when I first got, really started practicing. That was the foundation. And I think that writing and needing to, kind of like condense and clarify and solidify all of these ideas that I had about these different cycles and practices into a book that someone else could read and understand and integrate for themselves was actually a really powerful thing for myself too, of like, who do I speak to? Who am I? Finding words that can really describe who I am as a writer, as a witch, what I do, how I help people, how these different tools can help people. And I do talk about them in a little bit different way than a lot of people do. And yeah, I think that writing is so powerful in helping us to really find that clarity, really find when you have to describe and teach something to someone else, it really helps you clarify it for yourself too. And yeah, I think it has really helped me clarify, who my people are and how I get to show up for them.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me. I mean, I think there is just something like you said about the act of getting it out, writing it, to almost like take a step back to examine it, where if it's in your head, you can't always do that. It's just an opportunity to, I've joked often that, I write fiction as therapy, and it's not a lie. It's not 100% true, but there's no lie in it either. So.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that writing, this isn't true for everyone, certainly true for me. And I think it's true for a lot of people that writing is a spiritual practice in and of itself, even if I don't consider it like this core essential part of who I am as a witch, nonetheless it is, there's no denying it. Like it is. And I don't know, words are spells, right?
Yeah. Oh, they are. Language has power. And even if you're not a writer, language has power. I think about the magic of reading. It's, you pick up a book and that author is either going to teach you something or take you somewhere that you wouldn't go by yourself. So.
Yeah. So magical.
So before we get to our little game of chance at the end, I want to give you an opportunity to tell folks what's coming up next and where they can find you.
Yeah. So everything's on my website. It's witchoflupinhollow.com. You can find the books there. They're also, local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all places. And then you can find, I have a free class on the moon phases, all kinds of things on my website. I'm also on Instagram at Lupin Hollow. And mostly what's coming up next is everything that I'm currently working on. All of the seasonal content coming up for, I think this is coming out in the winter, so coming out for the new year. I'll definitely have new things coming up with the Starlight Coven, which is my seasonal subscription, and probably some events in the new year and things too. When we're recording this, I'm about to be launching my 3rd annual Empowered Modern Witches Summit, which will be done by the time it comes out. But there's more of those definitely on the horizon. I do virtual summits and festivals, and those are really, really fun. So definitely, if you're really listening to this, check the website and see what the next thing I'm hosting is.
Awesome.
And then I am hoping to write another book, but it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, a discussion phase.
Yes.
Great. Well, we'll have links for all that for folks in the show notes so they can find it a little easier. Like you said, people might always not come back to the recording. So for last question, and you will appreciate that as an astrologer, I'm a double Scorpio, so I like to talk. Small talk is not a thing that I enjoy very much. I really would like to get down to brass tacks with people and ask them what they think happens when we die. So I'm going to roll a die. And depending on what I get, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. All those good Scorpio things. And they'll be related to writing your book. I try not to blindside people too much. Although there are also no rules to this game. So 5, money. Oh, I'm so glad you got this one because I had fun coming up with this question. So if witches could only barter with each other for spells, ingredients, books, etc., what would be the most valuable thing another witch could trade with you?
That I could give them or they could give me?
Both.
Both. Oh, I don't know. I think that my connection to and gift for astrology is probably one of my most valuable things to give. Is, I don't know, astrology. I kind of joke that it's like my first language because it just makes sense to me in a way that I can't even really explain and can't even really describe. And people often tell me that, you know, when they first start learning astrology from me, that things make sense that haven't made sense to them for, you know, decades. And so I think that would be something that obviously I do give and do share a lot of, but that I think is one of my most valuable things to give. And I don't know, to receive, I find receiving like energy work, really, like clearings, healings, light language, things like that. Like that's something I've been receiving a lot of recently. And it's something that is so outside of what I do in a lot of ways, that I think is really much an exchange where, you know, it's something that I'm seeking out other people for their gifts around that. So I've been listening to a lot of like light language meditations and things like that. That is just not at all something I do or create or put out, and really love to receive. So yeah.
I mean, I guess this is kind of a follow-up question, but like I think about like witchcraft and capitalism a lot because, you know, we have to put food on the table, right? And I mean, really, you're a capitalist if you're exploiting other people's labor for that. If it's your own labor, you're not really a capitalist in that same way.
Right.
But like, when you decided to like become an astrologer who did readings for people and kind of do that, what was the process of kind of going, okay, how do I figure out what I can charge people and how do I figure out how to, you know, price things fairly and think about like what this exchange, because money, you know, that is an energy exchange too in a lot of ways. And so how do you make decisions around that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually hilarious to me that this is the question that came up on the die because Taurus Sun, 8th house stellium, money is a big theme for me, and always has been. So there's no coincidences. And yeah, I mean, this is something that I work on and think about a lot too. And I feel like the answer is a little bit different for each individual program or product or offer. You know, some things that I offer, I do on a sliding scale, which I think a sliding scale is an amazing way to make things more accessible. And it also can be very difficult to manage as a business owner. So I only do them on certain things. So the main thing that I do sliding scale on is my virtual summits. And then we do a profit sharing model. So like my summits are very radical. And I have friends who do summits who are like, wow, you do it so differently, like in every possible way. You know, so we do 50% of profits go to the speakers, and the passes are on a sliding scale. We also make the replays available for free for longer than most people do with a summit, so that people who can't afford to buy a pass or aren't interested in a pass still have the opportunity to watch them all, if they want to take that time. So, you know, on the one hand, there's certain things that where I think accessibility and, you know, profit sharing and making sure people get paid is so important, and really making sure people get paid both, you know, as myself, as yourself, as a business owner, right, is really important. And also making sure that people that we're working with and who are around us are getting paid as well, is really important to me. I think people deserve to be compensated and compensated well. Like we often discount the value of our spiritual gifts. You know, there's a lot of, I feel like it's less and less, but there's always been a lot of talk in the spiritual community of, you know, there's something wrong with charging for your gifts, which I think there's something so desperately wrong with that statement to me. Because if anything, they're more valuable than our practical, tangible skills. So there's that piece. And then, you know, there's also, I guess, very relatedly, the piece of as much as things I think should be accessible, I think we also deserve to be compensated well. And so, you know, I have things on my website for $9 and I have things on my website for thousands of dollars. And I think a range is important to me, so that, you know, if I grew up in a really small rural town, and my mom and I had a gift shop, we had a flower shop for many years. And we had things in the store. We did, you know, amazing weddings that were, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars. We also always had something in the store for $1. And people would sometimes come in, you know, oh, your store's so expensive. And we would always say, you know, yes, there are things you may not be able to afford in here, but we work really hard to, you know, have locally made things and be able to pay the people who made them and to be able to support ourselves. And we also have something for $1. And that has always really informed kind of my approach to pricing in business is, you know, I deserve to be compensated well. The people I work with deserve to be compensated well. And people deserve for things to be accessible too. Yeah. Whether that's, you know, a low cost product or, you know, just following someone on Instagram and getting their newsletter or whatever it is. I mean, even that, I think we sometimes discount how valuable it is to just receive free content from someone, even if you're not in their paid program. So I think that there's kind of these degrees, you know, that I don't think there's a perfect system. There's certainly not a perfect system. I don't think there's a perfect answer. But, you know, I think if there's a spectrum and a range of accessibility and really abundant compensation, like that's the best I can ask for.
Yeah. And I think just being thoughtful about it. I mean, I think that to me is important. Like just, you know, as a writer where my main product is books, you know, like the work is done and I get that the book goes out, but it like piracy just like bugs the shit out of me because I'm like, if you want a copy of my book and you can't afford it, I will send it to you. I will send you an ebook. I will happily do that in a heartbeat. If you like, I really want to read this, but I can't. It's also available. There are places you can get the first one free online now. And I'm like, why would you then pirate it? Like, it's a strange thing. It's like, you know, I would love to not live in a capitalist hellscape. I would love that. But we do. Like, I have to eat. And, you know, like my work is valuable. So don't pirate it.
And I think,
email me and I'll send it to you.
No. 100%. I pay authors. Please pay authors. And what you said about, you know, like if we're working for ourselves and we're not exploiting other people, or even if we have people working for us, but we're not exploiting them, like it's not inherently like this evil capitalist thing to make money. Like money is not inherently evil and is not inherently capitalist, and we can do it differently. And we can't be perfect because we still live in a capitalist society, but we can do it differently. And I think that that's the shift that I'm seeing more and more of, and I want to see more of in the spiritual community, is recognizing that like, just because someone is charging, and even if someone is charging more than you can afford for something, that doesn't make the program or the person or the money behind it inherently wrong or evil. And very often, if you reach out to someone, you know, people often have sliding scales or scholarships, or they have some free thing that they can send you. Like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of, I mean, it comes down to this whole idea of like the illusion of separation, right? That we think there's this separation, like, oh, I can't afford that, or, you know, oh, that person is charging so much for something, or I don't know. I mean, there's so many ways that could spiral out, you know. And really, I think conversation and expecting the best in people, and you know, when you have an issue with a small business, talking to the small business before you know, Yelp or charge back or whatever. Like, yes. Like, most small business owners are really good people.
and are willing to work with you. And I think that, you know, when I ran a catering business, people are always like, well, that's too expensive. And I was like, you know, I'm making less than, you know, like $5. Like my margin is tiny. It's like, I have to buy the food. I have to pay someone to help me make the food. I have to pay someone to help me serve the food. You know, like I this is my overhead plus this tiny, like, you know, sometimes 2 or 3% margin. And, you know, I don't think that sometimes it's easy to look at a creative output and say, well, I could do that myself. And I'm like, yeah, you probably could. But, you know, like when I was catering, I went to culinary school. I've worked in this industry, blah, blah, blah. As a writer, you know, like I have been writing since I was a kid. You know, this is how many hours, you know, it takes me 3 years to write a novel. You know, like this is not just the thing you're holding in your hand. It's all the things that I had to do to get to where you can hold that thing in your hand too. And that's true for any creative thing.
Absolutely. And I think also just the inherent gift and unique wisdom of each person that, even if you could write this thing or make this thing for yourself, it's going to be different than if you're receiving it from that person. And you have to choose, like, do I want to do it for myself, or do I want to receive that person's energy and everything that comes behind them? And I think that this is so relevant in like the book world, because like I admit it still pains me a lot when I pay like $35 for a new book, because a lot of new books are getting up there.
Yeah.
But especially now having written 2 of them, and knowing how little authors make on each book sale, very, very, very small percentage if you're traditionally published. And I don't know. I mean, when you think about it that way, and you think about how much time it took someone to write this book and to have it edited and to put it all together and to, all of the research and the energy and the wisdom that came to them being able to write the book, how are we only paying $30 for books, right?
Right.
So I think there's such a catch-22 there where I'm like, I want books to be as accessible as possible. And my new book is, I think it's like $8 more than the first book. And I resisted it. I was like, can we make it a little bit less? And, the publishing company was like, I'd like to, but because they're roughly the same size, but just to print it, like it's got to be higher. And, I totally get that. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, even just with inflation and everything, but I think there needs to be, and I think there is starting to be this shift in not just, oh, that's too expensive for a book or for a service or for anything, and starting to see that like, this is actually a great deal. This is a great energetic exchange for how much this person has put into this book or whatever it is they're creating.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I always like to remind people, like most libraries, if you ask them to purchase a book, they have a program for patron suggestions. And that benefits authors too, because often with a traditional publisher, they pay more for a library binding, or for an ebook, they pay to have that. There's usually with a traditional publisher, there's a service for ebooks where they pay a little more to have an ebook in their library. So like it still benefits the author, but you get the book for free. And
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a great way to support people if you can't afford a book. So
absolutely. I think people definitely have not always valued libraries and their local bookstores. And, and I think that, I don't know, it'll be really interesting to see kind of where that goes in the next, 10, 15 years. Because on the one hand, I mean, like we have thriving local bookstores where I am, and I'm so grateful for a really successful local chain. I don't remember the last time even I went to the library, right? So I think that there's a lot of shifts that are happening and that need to happen around the way we think about the energy of, of money, the way we think about the energy of any kind of creative output and exchange. And also finding, both creating and recognizing what already exists for accessibility. I mean, libraries are so important and so essential, and we should, myself very much included, support them much more than we do, you know?
I'm an ebook fiend at the library, so I'm not in the building a lot, but I'm in their stacks a lot. So.
Yeah, well, and my best friend a few years ago discovered that our library had like thousands of movies and all kinds of things that we had no idea they had. Things that, we would pay like $5-10 to rent on Amazon or whatever. You could get them for free from the library, it turns out.
And magazine subscriptions. I mean, there's a ton of stuff you can do at the library now. Yeah. The digital libraries are amazing. I mean, it's just an amazing thing that we have at our fingertips. So, yeah. Oh, Tenae, thank you so much for this conversation and for being on the show. And it's nice to know that, we don't live that close in California, but we are kind of neighbors. We're relatively close. It's nice to know folks, other witches are in my general hood. It's always nice to know. So,
yeah, well, if you ever come up this way, definitely come visit.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Kaifel Agostini. Our music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. You can support our work at ko-fi.com/witchlitpodcast. And if you'd like to submit your own death, sex, religion, politics, or money questions, or have questions or comments about the show, you can send an email to victoria@witchlitpod.com. And please be sure to let us know if we can use your name on the show. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and consider giving us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.